Hello, in this tutorial video I'm going to make a forecast for the Ukraine war. This war started on February 24th, 2022, and I'm making this forecast on April 16th, almost 2 months after the war began. And I'm going to use Vibrational Astrology, which is an evidence-based system of astrology, and I will first show the model that we've created for what happens during wars like this, what triggers them, what helps bring them to an end. And then applying that model to this current war, we come up with a forecast of what will happen. So what we're going to look at are global rise and fall of anti-American and anti-Western feelings. So this is a graph that we will produce that shows the tendency of people to develop strong anti-American feelings, when those feelings increase and when they subside. So this is a graph that shows when there's a greater likelihood that cooperation with the United States and other Western-style democracies, when that cooperation tends to be high and when it tends to be low. And when the feeling of anti-American feeling is very strong and there's a lack of cooperation, it can often lead to an attack against the West. And here is a graph for the year 1939. So what we see in 1939 were 3 peaks of anti-American sentiment. One in March, that's the first one, a second one in late June and early July, and a third one in late August and early September. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. That's often looked at as a date that initiates the full-blown World War II, and we see that it happens at one of these peaks. Now, in itself, this one little bit of evidence is not that compelling or convincing that this graph actually shows when anti-Western and anti-American feelings reach a peak and people are more inclined to take action against the West. But this is just the first of many graphs to show you this. Now, let me read the information on this slide. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's armies invaded Poland. This graph shows that there was a tendency for cultures that are conservative and reserved. So what happens is a culture that is conservative and reserved tends to have increased feelings of distaste for Western style, free-spiritedness, loose living, and what is perceived as a lack of respect, reverence, tradition, and morals. Now, I'm not saying that America is this or is not that or other countries are. I'm talking about perception. I'm talking about images. I'm talking about what people respond to, how they understand what's happening. And for many people around the world, the United States is seen as free-spirited, loose-living, and tending to lack respect, reverence, tradition, and morals. So it's a loose, free, wild country that's lost its roots. This is what many people are perceiving. It bothers them. When that feeling of being irritated, being overpowered, being transformed, like America's going to transform us and change our way to their way, those feelings get very strong. Then these more conservative cultures will rebel and take action against the West. Again, you can use whatever terminology you want. For this astrological analysis, I'm trying to avoid judgments as to who's right or who's wrong. We all have our opinions about that and our feelings, but I think we can all agree that that's a dynamic that goes on, and people's feelings about America and its free-spiritedness do get inflamed and they get hostile towards the West, and then they subside. So I'm saying that those feelings increase at these 3 periods of time. Now, let's look at some more graphs. I have a lot of them. Here is a graph for 2001. And of course, on September 11, 2001, was the attack of the World Trade Center, where the airplanes flew right into the World Trade Center. An act of defiance and aggression against America and its strength in the world. Interestingly, it's a World Trade Center in the United States, showing how America is a center of power that distributes out into the whole world. And as usual, we will see these kinds of attacks and aggression against America and Western-style living happening when this sentiment is high. So in 2001, there was a peak in anti-American and anti-Western style feelings, these feelings in very late May, and then this very long period. Now, when this period is long, that is more powerful. So there's two things that create an intensity of feeling. One is, of course, the height of the graph, and also how long it lasts. So this one lasts from September through October. So for about 2 months, anti-American sentiment is very high. Towards the beginning of this time period is when 9/11 occurs. When we see this graph, it tells us that the feelings that motivated this action continue very strong for 2 months, and it means that the people will continue to feel angry and hostile and tend to defend what happens. It was not one little blip like we see here in late May. It's the beginning of a long-lasting time period. Okay, so now we see 2 cases of aggression against Western-style culture, and the peak is high. Again, it's not absolutely convincing, but what we're doing here is we're building a model using data visualization to see if the model makes sense. These are basic principles of an evidence-based practice, to be able to model your ideas and show whether they're working. So here we see 2 cases that show the model works reasonably well. Now here is the third case, which is the one we're focusing on right now because it's happening right now, is Vladimir Putin's military in Russia invading Ukraine starting on February 24th. Again, it's during one of these anti-Western periods, and this graph is for the year, it's for 1 year starting on July 1st, 2021, ending on July 1st, 2022. I started it at the half-year point, middle of 2021 to middle of 2022, because I wanted to see this date, not near the very, very beginning or very, very end. So I picked the half-year point, and this is the graph that I obtained. And we see again that it happens at a peak. And interestingly, it's on the down slope. And let me read what I have here on this slide, because it makes an additional point that reinforces the feeling that this graph does correlate well with the invasion of Ukraine. So, to read from the slide, on February 24th, 2022, Vladimir Putin's military invades Ukraine. This is towards the end of a relatively long period of over 2 weeks of strong anti-American and anti-Western feelings, over about 2 weeks. So this is a wide period as well as relatively high. I would say that this 2-week period is the strongest period of anti-American sentiment through that year, and the second strongest is this one that goes even higher, a little bit thinner. So these 2 are the big ones. Again, our model is working pretty well. To continue with what is written on the slide, it is reported that he wanted to invade a few days earlier, but waited until the Olympics in China were done. So this has been reported in the news. We don't know if it's true. We don't know what goes on in these quiet, secret negotiations. I believe it's true that China asked Russia to hold off on this invasion until after these Olympic Games finished in China, and that would have been right at the peak. So what the graph shows is not what happens. This is not a crystal ball. What this shows us is what the motivation is, what the energy dynamics are. What people do about those energy dynamics is up to the people. What vibrational astrology shows us is the rise and fall of motivations, drives, and interests. So this graph peaked right when Vladimir Putin was ready to bring Ukraine back to Russia, to bring Ukraine out of the clutches of the West. Strong anti-Western sentiment. Let's bring it back right at the peak. He doesn't take action until a few days later because of circumstances that are happening in the world. The circumstances that are happening in the world are whatever they are. We cannot predict all of those circumstances. What we can predict is how energy dynamics and motivations are likely to change. This correlates extremely well with what happened. So we have three situations. We have World War II, we have 9/11, 2001, and we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And these graphs work. They work well. As we continue, we're going to see more and more evidence through this data visualization that the model is fitting the events. So again, this is a unique form of astrology. There's nothing else like this at this point in time, where we build models, we test them, we use data visualization tools, we use statistical analysis, all of these things to see if the models are working well. Now, here we have a graph of, what I did here is I went for 2 years. So I extended it another year because I want to make a forecast. So let's go to the previous slide. This previous slide from middle of 2021 to middle of 2022. Then we do another year. So the left side of this graph is exactly what we saw on the previous slide. The right side of the graph is for the following year, from the middle of 2022 to the middle of 2023. And oh my goodness, when I produced this graph, I was stunned. I was shocked because you will see this extreme rise in anti-Western feelings only very rarely. And there it is in September and October of this coming year. I had no expectation of this. I have no intuition that the war is going to change in this way. So this becomes a good test of our model because it's something that we intuitively, or at least I intuitively, am not expecting. It's not on my mind. But what the graph is telling me, contrary to what I might expect, is that in September and October, if the war lasts that long, we don't know if it'll last that long because the anti-American sentiment is low through April, May, June, July, August. This summer is the chance to bring this war to an end. If it does not end by September, big trouble develops according to the model. The Russian anti-Western sentiment becomes tremendously inflamed. Good chance they will get the support of other countries, perhaps China and India, which has been non-committal. I don't anticipate that India would suddenly become like pro-Russian, but perhaps certain political parties within India. However it happens, there's this model is predicting that in September and October 2022, if the war is still happening, I don't know if it'll be happening or not, but if it is, the West meets huge problems. Ukraine and its supporters, the United States and the European democracies, etc., run into big problems because the anti-Western sentiment goes through the roof for 2 months and then has another peak around late February of 2023. So that's the forecast. Let me say it again very simply, so there's no question about this. It's possible the war will end before September. The anti-Western sentiment is fairly low this summer. I'm making this forecast in the middle of April. That's right about here, during the beginning of this lull in anti-Western sentiment. This means that a lot of Russians will continue to leave Russia. It means that the military of Russia will continue to have problems with morale and support, but that changes in September and October. So if the war continues, Ukraine is in trouble. So Zelensky is begging for help. He needs this help to resolve this before we get to September. And Ukraine needs to either have stopped this, come to some kind of settlement, or weakened Russia beyond repair so that this new wave of anti-Western sentiment does not have the resources to succeed. But they will go full blast in September and October, according to our model. So let me read from the what I've written here to see if I've missed anything. So I decided to produce a graph for another year because I want to see what's going to happen. And it shows the anti-Western feelings from middle of 2021 to middle of 2023. And there's the big surprise. The anti-Western feelings high in September, October, and early November. And then again in late February and early March. Russia is likely to claim parts of eastern Ukraine as part of Russia in September and October. So it seems somewhat unlikely, just using common sense, that all of eastern Ukraine, which has been occupied by pro-Russian people and military for a long time, it seems unlikely that by September Russia would be kicked out of Ukraine completely. And if that does not happen, then we can expect that Russia is going to claim that those eastern territories in the Ukraine as part of Russia. This is the kind of thing that happens when the sentiment gets very strong, and also may get support from other countries, as I mentioned. And then they reassert their strength again in late February, March. So it's not until spring of 2023 that things settle down again. And I didn't produce this graph farther into the future, so that's as far as I've taken it. That's our forecast. These astrological forecasts are not like black and white because they're telling us how motivation changes and what will happen given certain activities. This is what will happen. But they're clear. They're very, very clear in that if the war is still ongoing on September 1st, 2022, then the Russian motivation and strength increases for 2 months. Now, let's look at a larger context for anti-American sentiment. What I've shown you so far is 1-year time periods and a 2-year time period. Let's look at a 40-year time period from 1990 to 2030. So from January 1st, 1990 to January 1st, 2030, 40 years. And I graphed it and then I filled this with a light green color to make it easier to read, fill these areas where there's anti-American sentiment so you can see it easily. And if you just kind of sit back and look at this screen, what do you notice? What you notice is that starting around 1995 or 1996, there's a big wave of anti-American sentiment. This looks almost like a bowl. It starts around 95, 96, reaches a peak around 2006, 2007, 2008, and then comes down and ends around 2017. It dies out, and then you get some periodic blips, and one of those blips is the invasion of the Ukraine. So let's see, right there. So I've got a note here, Russia invades Ukraine. That's the little blip. So when we look at the 1 year and 2 year periods, we're looking at this section here where I've got these red arrows pointing to, and that wide period of 2 weeks is right there when I expect, we could say that not that I expect, but the model predicts that anti-American sentiment is strong there. But compare that 2 week period, which is very strong, is nothing compared to what's been going on from 1996 to 2017. So 1996 to 2017, there's a huge global tendency to embrace the old, conservative, historical, traditional way of life, to be skeptical of the wild, crazy life of the West, and especially of America, where there's loose living, there's there's very little dress code. People are so informal, they're disrespectful. From their point of view, I'm not saying what is, I'm not giving my opinion, I'm not saying there's any objective reality, I'm saying these are the realities that people experience. This is what they understand, and this is what they're responding to. So there's an enormous anti-American wave from 1996 to 2017, and that is the time of the war on terror. It correlates exactly. I didn't bring this website up in a browser, but at history.com/topic/21st-century-war on terror timeline. If you go to that website or you Google this and find it, they give a timeline which matches this exactly. And there, by the way, I've got a red arrow and a little circle pointing to the 9/11, the planes crashing into the World Trade Center towers. Fairly early on, actually, the anti-American sentiment had already been building up for at least 5 years. For at least 5 years it was building up. By this time, the West should have been on alert and been aware that anti-American sentiment is getting outrageously strong. It is outrageously strong. It has increased tremendously. Now, whoever is the President of the United States, whoever the Congress is, whatever activities are going on in the United States, in France, England, Germany, etc., whatever is happening there is going to affect this. And if the right policies are in place, if the right programs are operational, then that will minimize the effect of this. And this does not have to be anti-American sentiment. I'll talk a little bit more later about why this is anti-American sentiment. Well, I'll show you the astrology of it, but again, the basic idea is it's anti-American sentiment because the sense that America is pushing their agenda, which these cultures do not like, and they do not want, and they do not want to lose their hundreds or thousands of years of tradition. So this had already been building by the time 2001, and look at all that time ahead of us. This is such an incredibly powerful wave. Now, I didn't have these beautiful graphs and ways of visualizing this, and I did not have the formula as exact as I do now in 2001, but even all the way back in 2001, 21 years ago, I had predicted that if this conflict was not resolved rapidly, it would go on till probably the year 2020 or so. That's exactly what happened. Not that the war on terror is over, but it has subsided. The United States, for the most part, is pulled out of Afghanistan and so on. the Taliban took over again. It's been placated. The emotion has been has subsided somewhat, and now we're dealing with periodic conflicts that happen from these little bumps that happen, such as in the Ukraine, and also the failure to resolve anything, to make any progress for the countries that the United States and other countries got involved in, to have made any progress, to have stepped forward to resolve the problems that they had. So little was achieved that now this huge time period has left a scar, you might say, and so these little blips can become very strong. The graph is not telling us, let me say this again, it's not telling us exactly what's going to happen in the world. It's telling us what the sentiment is, and that sentiment is going to get expressed according to the context of people's lives. Given the failure of the war on terror, failure economically, politically, in terms of lost lives, it didn't work overall. I mean, it worked to the extent that there wasn't another 9/11 attack, but it did not work to the extent that the world became resolved and the East and West became great friends. That has not happened. So, given that you might say there are scars, there's a feeling that the East and West have not found a meeting place. We see that especially in Russia, and consequently, we have the escalation. Now, I know a lot of people watching this have their own theories on specific actions that the United States took, specific policies. Well, let me be clear about one of them. I don't have to, avoid all of the details of this, but the United States has sometimes talked about regime change. The United States has used that term, regime change, repeatedly over the previous years. When we look at this graph, was it smart for the United States to talk about regime change, not just talk about it, to attempt to implement it? No. Huge error. And now people are talking about it and saying, the West, America, etc., has helped instigate these problems by irritating people in these countries. I was saying that in 2001 by understanding the astrology of how this would develop. And now we're seeing 21 years later all of this work out, and people finally realizing the effect of that kind of thinking. Every country has good and bad policies, and I don't think it's wise to make things black and white, but that one aspect of American foreign policy was a disaster, because when this anti-American sentiment is high, you are not able to change people's lives, nor do you want to, and it is not a good idea. You want to bring out the best in what this energy represents, and I'll talk a little bit more about the astrology of it in a continuing video. This is going to be at least a series of 2 videos. Okay. Now this, I think, will be my last slide. No, you know what? I'm going to end here because I've got several slides that all work together. Let me stop here and just conclude that, number one, we have built a model for anti-American sentiment. In the next video, I'm going to show you a model for pro-American sentiment. We have a graph for the rise and fall of anti-American sentiment and a graph for the rise and fall of pro-American sentiment. And there are 2 separate sentiments that can overlap. They can be independent of each other. They do not necessarily balance each other because they're 2 different vibrations, a vibration of anti-American sentiment and a vibration of pro-American sentiment. We'll look at that and we'll see how that affected World War II, how that will affect the Ukraine war. So what we've done is we've built a model, and in the next video I'm also going to talk about the way that this model is built. It's what we call elegant, simple, the fact that it's an elegant, simple model that corresponds exactly to our theory, all increases our confidence in the model. So what we're doing is we're talking about models, we're talking about testing them, developing them, perfecting them, seeing the consequences of the model, seeing if those consequences actually develop in real life. This is a wholly different kind of astrology from anything else that I know of. This is built on fantastic work of many, many other astrologers who did take an evidence-based approach, but that evidence-based approach has lost in its popularity in recent years, and now that we have powerful computers and databases, we can pick up with the work that was done decades ago in developing an evidence-based kind of astrology, and now we have it, and we have very impressive studies that show that astrological variables actually do affect human behavior. This is no longer just a philosophical or intuitive debate. We now have the data. Okay, let's stop here and continue with this forecast for the Ukraine war in a part 2 of this series of videos. Thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.